And there seems to be certain events that occur in our nation's history that become embedded in everybody's memory. And I think the assassination of John F. Kennedy is one of those. I read an article this weekend from the Boston Globe, and it was an article discussing the Kennedy legacy. And the quotes that I took from that are that the wound's still fresh. The second one, half a century after we lost Kennedy, it seems that no matter how you paint him, there's more to see. So we're fortunate today to have a speaker on the topic of the Kennedy assassination, Dr. Elwood Watson. Dr. Watson is a professor of history from ETSU. He has a PhD in American history from the University of Maine, a master's in American history from the University of Delaware, a bachelor's of arts in American history from the University of Delaware. He has a rather lengthy CV. You can see that in his in the notebook. I thank Dr. Watson for coming. We appreciate you being here, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dressler, for that good, wonderful introduction. As he told you, my name is Professor Elwood Watson, and I'm a professor at East Tennessee State University. And I was asked to come and talk about the Kennedy assassination. That topic alone is so broad, so there are so many angles that it could have been taken from. So I'm going to give you an overview. I'm going to talk about primarily the background of Kennedy. Obviously, this was the 50th assassination of his death. Also look at the tributes to Kennedy. Also look at the Camelot Myth, how he would have looked at various issues, civil rights, Vietnam, and also the post-Kennedy era, and what if within 30 minutes. So yeah. And I guess there will be a question answer session or as well. Okay. As well. First of all, I'd like to go ahead and show this, and I'll pass it around if anybody wants to. This is the 50th anniversary of the Dallas Morning News, which is where he was obviously, slain as well. Does anybody want to take this around? Pass it around. Thank you. Today is the 50th, today, 50 years ago, exactly half a century, the nation's 35th president, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The first hour after the shooting before his death was announced was a time of great confusion. If it was first unclear whether the shooting might have been part of a larger attack upon the U.S. or whether Vice President Lyndon Johnson had been riding 2 cars behind and the motorcade was safe as well. The news shocked the nation. Men and women wept openly. Some of my older family members or relatives told me that they cried openly upon hearing the news. People gathered in department stores to watch the television coverage while others prayed. Traffic in some areas came to a halt as the news spread on various interstates throughout the nation. Millions of schools across the nation dismissed their students early. The state of Texas and the city of Dallas in particular became the source of deep resentment and anger in the fact that in certain cities and other places across the country, and in the world for that matter, carried signs decrying the city, denouncing it as a city that, quote, killed the president. In fact, former talk show host, philanthropist, and media celebrity Oprah Winfrey made the comment on her former talk show that dedicated an episode to the then 35th anniversary of the assassination. She looked to her father and said the following, quote, "There are some bad people down there in Dallas." The event left an indelible impression on many Americans in the fact that it has been permanently etched in the mindsets and the psyche of American culture. It was indeed a defining moment for a generation. Just as December 7th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor was the defining moment for the silent generation, those who were born between 1925 and 1945, the Space Shuttle Challenger tragedy on January 26, 1986 was the definitive moment for Generation X, my generation. And also the September 11th, 2001 attacks was the decisive moment for the millennial generation, Generation Y. The Kennedy assassination moment was the symbolic moment for many baby boomers. As with many previous and future tragedies that have afflicted our nation, the assassination dissolved differences among many people as they were brought together in one common theme: shock and sorrow. It was seen in statements by former presidents and members of Congress who were alive at the time. The news hit with such gut-wrenching impact. According to the Nielsen Alderman Service, within 40 minutes of the first reporting of the assassination, the television audiences in the nation had doubled. By early evening, 70% were glued to their television sets. In fact, entire towns were glued to the television sets. Then Roger Mudd, at the time a Washington correspondent for CBS News, remarked, quote, "It was a death that touched everyone instantly and directly. Rare was the person who did not cry during that long weekend." In our home, my wife, EJ, watched the television. Her tears caused our 5-year-old son, Daniel, to go quietly and switch off what he thought was the cause of his mother's weeping, end of quote. From an international perspective, many world leaders expressed shock and sorrow, some going on television in their respective countries to address their countrymen, also expressing shock over the assassination. Citizens throughout the world were as well. At U.S. embassies and consulates around the world, switchboards lit up or were flooded with phone calls. All of them shocked, and condolences books were established for people to sign. In Europe, the assassination tempered Cold War sentiment, as both people on both sides expressed shock and sorrow at the assassination. Hastily organized memorial services for the president were held throughout the world, allowing many to express their grief. A day of national mourning and sorrow was declared on Monday, November 25th, and there was a state funeral, the day of state funeral. Many countries did the same in symbolic gestures for the president. Throughout the United States, many states declared the day a funeral, a legal holiday. That being said, not all sporting events and recreational events were canceled that weekend. Those that went on shared the sentiment of then NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle, expressing and deciding to play NFL games that weekend. Quote, to quote Rozelle, "It has been traditional to perform in times of great personal tragedy." After their win over the Philadelphia Eagles in Philadelphia, players on the Washington Redskins asked then coach Bill McPeak to send the game ball to the White House, thanking Rozelle for allowing the games to be played that weekend, saying, quote, "Playing for President Kennedy in his memory." The initial CBS bulletin at the time interrupted the soap opera As the World Turns at 1:40 that afternoon. Mourning for Kennedy lasted for a long time. Towns were deserted while services were held. Everyone could follow the proceedings on television. It was also important to note that schools, offices, and factories were also closed. There was also an open scheduled minute of silence. Others permitted employees to attend time off to attend the memorial services in their local towns and communities. Church bells tolled. In some cities, police officers attached black bands to their badges. In many states, governors declared the day a national mourning, as well as a legal holiday in their state. The somber mood across the nation was evident by 3 p.m. Every television station and many radio stations canceled a traditional form of entertainment, ABC, CBS, and NBC. It was not unusual to see classical music replace traditional music that day in many radio stations and on many TV stations as well. Commercial free, a lot of commercials were commercial free, and they also had many paraphernalia, and also many bookstores were careful to remove certain products associated with the Kennedy. For example, the highly successful comedy, The First Family, that parodied the Kennedys, was quickly pulled from circulation and remained that way for many years. Also, A Christmas Gift from You from Phil Spector was pulled from store shelves and was not. It was released back in mid-1964, but it really did not chart the pop charts until 1972. Also, certain Kennedy impersonators such as Vaughn Meade, who was wildly popular, saw their careers implode. Throughout overseas in Britain, the heavy metal band Saxon wrote Dallas 1 p.m. as a tribute, talking about, quoting, "The world was shocked that fateful day. A young man's life was blown away at Dallas 1 p.m. Also, Joe Meck of the Tornadoes Telstar released an instrumental called The Kennedy March on Decca Records, and royalties were sent to Jackie Kennedy, former First Lady, to donate to charity. The Briarwood Singers had a song called Bubbled Under, which hit the Billboard charts in December of 1963 with a recording of the traditional folk song, "He Was a Friend of Mine," which was later re-recorded by Jim McGuinn in 1965, and also by the popular American band at the time, The Byrds, on their second album, Turn, Turn, Turn. In 1964, songwriter William Spivey penned Mr. John, which became popular in the Midwestern parts of the United States as well. Then that was some background about some of the popular culture and how many people were initially reacted to the assassination, as private citizens, public figures, and the like. There was also the Camelot myth that was associated with the Kennedys as well. There's often been temptation by many journalists and historians to define the Kennedy administration as the Camelot era. This is a largely manufactured myth. In fact, many years later, a number of cabinet officials and aides who served in the White House during his administration made the case that no one they worked with saw themselves, let alone President Kennedy, in such a manner. It has also been argued by some historians that the image of Camelot was created by Jacqueline Kennedy, whose lines, don't let it be forgot, there was once a spot for one brief shining moment that was known as Camelot. That also came from the popular score Broadway musical that drew on the Arthurian legend. And it was also important to note that Jacqueline Kennedy was very, very self-conscious of her image, those of her children, and those of her late husband. And she also went to Hyannis Port to meet with political reporter Theodore White a week after the assassination to shape how history would record and review the Kennedy presidency as well. So she had a lot to do. Many argued that Jacqueline Kennedy, the late First Lady, who died about 20 years ago, had a lot to do with shaping the image of Camelot and promoting that image to the larger public. Now, what I'll be talking about for most of the rest of this talk is what would have happened if JFK had survived his assassination. Obviously, as historians, generally don't like to get into the what ifs, but I was asked to talk about the what ifs today, so therefore, what ifs are what they are. We can't, that's kind of it's not concrete history. One could argue it's more of I wouldn't call it revisionist history, but it's probably more of a psychoanalyst history. So that's what I'll be doing here today as well. As earlier stated, Kennedy was killed today on Dealey Plaza, 50 years ago today. His accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, also himself died at the hands of a mentally unstable nightclub owner named Jack Ruby 2 days later. Ruby himself dies in prison in 1967. Since then, many theories have sprung up about the assassination, who was involved, and why was Kennedy killed. Among some historians like myself and some authors, there's been passionate debate and discussion about what would have happened in the event that Kennedy was not killed in November of 1963. Numerous topics on the subject have garnered considerable debate. In fact, just recently, veteran journalist Jeff Greeneville has written a riveting, engaging account of a post-1964 second-term Kennedy and the direction his presidency would have taken in his book entitled, What If JFK Had Lived? The truth is that Kennedy was committed to running again in 1964, and based on the theories among prominent historians at the time, he had a good chance of winning. The fact was his popularity was at 58% right before the assassination, just after he had served only 1,000 days in office. This number was higher than that for Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush Jr., and our current President Barack Obama, 5 presidents who won re-election bids. In fact, it was a common narrative among both Democrats and Republican Party officials at the time that no Republican would defeat John F. Kennedy in 1964. Therefore, the GOP would nominate someone to serve as a sacrificial lamb and focus their energies toward 1968 and possibly winning the Senate in the interim. The presumptive nominee for Republicans in late 1963 was Senator Barry Goldwater. He was friends with Kennedy and briefly dropped out of the race after Kennedy's death, once to only re-enter it to oppose Lyndon Johnson, who he disliked intensely. Reportedly, Kennedy had agreed to debate with Goldwater, but Lyndon Johnson, on the other hand, had no intentions or desires to debate Barry Goldwater. The outcome of an election between Kennedy and Goldwater would have been decided by 2 issues that year, as far as I see: civil rights, the 1964 election, and Vietnam. These are the 3 main topics I think that we can really look at and see how Kennedy may have certainly responded to these events. All of them were in part in the nation's psyche and part of his agenda as the run-up to the 1964 presidential campaign. On tape recordings made in the White House just before his death, Kennedy told his advisors that he expected a tough re-election campaign because of his support for civil rights. President Kennedy had introduced the Historical Civil Rights Act to Congress in June of 1963, where it was stalled at the time of his death. The Civil Rights Act faced fierce opposition in Congress, mostly from Southern Democrats, and Kennedy rejected an attempt to substitute a bill that would allow segregation at public facilities to continue at the time. After his death, President Johnson told the nation that the passing of the Civil Rights Act would be the best way to honor President Kennedy's legacy. But it took until July of 1964 for Johnson and his allies to get the act approved. It is also important to realize that many of those Southern Democrats, such as the late Strom Thurmond and others, switched their political affiliation to the Republican Party after the passage of the Civil Rights Bill in July of 1964. If Kennedy had lived, the debate over the Civil Rights Act would have occurred during an election year and most likely probably would have been delayed. As far as I see it, it was probably very probable that Kennedy would have waited until after the 1964 election with the hope of having more leverage in Congress to pass the act. the combination of Kennedy and Johnson would have tackled the bill, which would have been a protracted battle. And it's also important to realize that despite many common narratives in regards to the Kennedys were not necessarily, there were many external organizations, that were pressuring them to become more proactive on civil rights. Hollywood, influential celebrities such as Frank Sinatra, powerful liberal lobbies, influential religious leaders, prominent black Americans of the era, and other groups. In fact, entertainers such as Harry Belafonte, who is still alive and making news, the late Sammy Davis Jr., as well as the late James Baldwin, and others frequently consulted Kennedy in private on advice on how to improve the current situations for blacks in America, then at the time Negroes in America. Truth be told, Kennedy and his brother, both the Kennedys and his brother John and his brother Robert, the Attorney General at the time, were not as adamant and committed to the issue of civil rights as many historical narratives have been led to believe. On the contrary, they saw civil rights as a diversion and a nuisance to their primary goals, which was containing communism and fighting the Cold War. Moreover, they viewed many of the movement's leaders, such as Martin Luther King Jr., Bayard Rustin, Ralph Abernathy, Walter Fauntleroy, Whitney Young, and others as minor rabble-rousers, unnecessarily misguiding Negro people, and in particular young Negro people, into dangerously and possibly unwinnable situations. A lot of their antipathy to the civil rights movement and certain leaders was due to the fact that then much of the information that J. Edgar Hoover, then director of the FBI, supplied Kennedy with about the leaders of the movement, in particular Martin Luther King Jr., sex life, and the sexual proclivities of other leaders of the movement. In fact, Robert Kennedy was so reviled, the president's brother, by civil rights activist Bayard Rustin, a man who was openly gay at a time when very few people were transparent about their sexuality, that he referred to the late activist as that little black, the F word, I don't want to say it, but the F word, you can read between the lines there, once in a cabinet meeting. Speculations aside, we all know that President Johnson was able to get the Civil Rights Bill passed in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act passed the following year on August 6, 1965. Using his mandate from a landslide election victory, Kennedy's legacy and his considerable powers over Congress, and a whole bunch of other domestic legislation which happened under President Johnson's watch. It is important to realize, too, that Lyndon Johnson was able to get a lot of things done probably Kennedy wouldn't have gotten on civil rights, given also his connection to minorities more so than Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson grew up in Texas. Now, at that time, the largest minorities in Texas, or the people he was probably more acquainted with, were Latinos, but he also knew poverty, and he also knew a lot of situations. Unlike Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson grew up poor. His father, he grew up poor. He died at 64 years old in 1973. His father died at 64 years old, and his grandfather died at 64. The only difference was he died a very former president of the United States and a very successful man. But he also knew poverty. He knew the situation that was first, and helped a lot of people in the nation where a lot of people were being certainly oppressed by. At the time when he became president of the United States, 40% of America was living in what we would call poverty when Lyndon Johnson became president. That type of poverty today is down around to about 5%. So he started, obviously, Medicaid and others. I know this is not talking about Lyndon Johnson, but I did want to give you that background in a sense where he had a lot to do in getting Congress done. But also Lyndon Johnson was more empathetic to poor people because he had been one. And that being said, he's also more ruthless than Kennedy in many ways. Lyndon Johnson, there's several books about Robert Cairo, if you're interested in Lyndon Johnson. He's written several volumes about Lyndon Johnson. Kennedy was not as aggressive, and Lyndon Johnson could be ruthless, okay? So we talk about Hoover and JFK. Johnson worked with Hoover in many ways, and you might question some of his motives, but he was definitely ruthless. we'll leave it there, as well, to get things accomplished. In regards to Vietnam, there were many tapes released. A few years ago, there were a lot of tapes released in 1963 of November, right before his assassination, that also showed Kennedy's concern about the crisis in Vietnam as he quizzed two aides who had returned from Asia. Quote, on the other hand, to quote the president, you get the military saying that the war is going to get better, and on the other hand, you get the political opinion that it's with deterioration. I'd like to have an explanation of what the reason is for the difference, Kennedy asked. The president's brother, Robert Kennedy, did an audio interview for the Kennedy Library in April of 1964 that recounted thinking about the Vietnam War at the time of the president's death, that Vietnam could not fall to the communists. He had strong, overwhelming reasons for being in Vietnam and that they should win the war in Vietnam because they were afraid of the domino effect, and that if you do Southeast Asia, all of Vietnam, you lost all of Vietnam, and that could also spread to other parts of Asia. And everybody was clear that there was the overlying assumption that if we do lose Vietnam, any point of Vietnam gets invested, the rest of much of the Asian continent could even further go that way. Just before his death, South Vietnamese president Negro DM was killed in a military coup that was supported by the United States in 1963. This is also the year that many of the Buddhist monks were burning themselves because the DM regime was a very oppressive regime. I don't know how some of you who were alive at the time can remember probably seeing those things on TV when you saw monks setting themselves afire because it was such a oppressive DM regime at that time. The situation rapidly deteriorated in Vietnam after Kennedy's death, and Congress that year also voted for the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which many of you know, which gave President Johnson the ability to commit massive amounts of U.S. air troops without a war declaration. 2009, a few years ago, scholar and filmmaker Koji Matsuni took the subject of Kennedy and Vietnam in his documentary, Virtual JFK, Vietnam if Kennedy had lived. The film was based on a book and considerable research on the topic by academics at Brown University and the University of Toronto, which looked at large amounts of data and transcripts from the Kennedy administration. Matsuni and his researchers concluded that Kennedy would have sought a more diplomatic solution than Johnson, who committed troops to Vietnam, more troops to Vietnam in 1964, and that Kennedy wanted to be out of Vietnam in early 1966. Their theory was that Kennedy had a pattern of behavior established in his hand of earlier crises such as the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, which usually had the president going against the advice of his military advisors to find a diplomatic solution, and I do think that was part of his DNA. Planning documents from November 20, 1963 show that the U.S. had hoped to have all military personnel out of Vietnam by the end of 1965, unless there was, quote, justified exceptions. The fact is that the fall from the DM coup was unknown at the time of the JFK assassination. So how the president would have handled Vietnam during election year remains a mystery. That being said, I would argue that his intentions to withdraw by the mid-60s would have been nullified for several reasons. First, he was a very passionate and commitment to fight and prohibit the spread of communism wherever. It's also important to note that John F. Kennedy, even when he was a senator from Massachusetts, was a strong supporter of Joe McCarthy, and he definitely was very critical and denounced communism wherever he saw it. So I think he definitely had a genuine compassion commitment to prohibit communism, and I think that was a genuine commitment on his part. That also being said, I think there are too many other business interests and corporate interests that would have forced him to maintain course as well, unseen for circumstances. There was a lot of money to be made on that war, and many people would have certainly made every effort to make sure that he stayed in Vietnam. And I think Vietnam would not have been that easy pull in and pull out situation that he would have envisioned it to have been as well. John F. Kennedy himself, I would also answer is, my next segment is John F. Kennedy, what would happen to Kennedy today, living today in 2013? John F. Kennedy lived at a time when we did not have a 24/7 media cycle. The internet, cell phones, and other forms of electronic media did not exist. He also died right at the end of the early 1960s. This was the era of bubblegum pop, surfing USA, slumber parties, and a large degree of innocence, or rather the public facade of innocence, still engulfed much of the nation. By the mid-1960s, much of the nation began to dress itself from such Victorian images and began to expose the cracks in a once seemingly impervious armor. This brings the question how long Kennedy would have been able to conceal much of his own personal behavior, as well as other issues that were certainly swirling around America and beginning to unravel. Granted, the press corps in those days was much more deferential to the office of the presidency. Such a combative tone toward the presidency did not really occur until Watergate, or until after Watergate, should I say. Nonetheless, it's highly unlikely that he could have won an entire second term without his personal life being uncovered. He also had a sexual addiction that could possibly have jeopardized national security, and also such news like that would have been unable to be shielded from the press for much, much longer. Other questions that would come up with, how would he have handled the racial riots and racial upheaval of the late 1960s? How would he have dealt with the young people of America who at that time initially took orders from the elders without question, but only in a matter of a few years openly defied and questioned authority? What would have been his response to the death of Martin Luther King Jr., the death of his brother Bobby, the chaos at the 1968 Democratic National Convention, the rebellion of young people on college campuses? What would he have thought of the Curran Commission that declared America's two societies, one white and one black, in 1968? What would he have thought of the year 1968 and the 1960s in general? Would his charm image have tarnished? More interestingly, would a few or some of any of these events have come to pass had he lived? Unfortunately, in this case, time will never tell us. Speculation is our only guide. And in the interest of time, I'm going to take questions at that point. I am a supporter of gun control myself. I think there certainly needs to be background checks. I know we have the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, but I do think there has to be some monitoring and some I think background checks maybe, to determine not everybody obviously we know should have guns or should have access to guns. A lot of people felt, because they felt Oswald, who was supposedly a private citizen, and how did this person have access to, get so close to the Kennedys, and so it was very concerned about, the fact that somebody who so prominent could be killed by a private citizen or murdered. Yes, they thought, there should be at that time, and that debate's still with us half a century later.
I don't recall Jack Ruby being characterized as mentally ill before. I may have just missed that, but can you elaborate on that point you made as opposed to being grief-stricken or having other motivations?
Yeah, he had health problems and he suffered from depression. Jack Ruby had a history they found later on in his life. During that time, people did not discuss mental illness and like we do today. At that time, it was not known. But many years later, they found out he had suffered from depression. He was bipolar. And there were a lot of other, he's paranoid. He suffered from a mild degree of schizophrenia. So what we would call mental illness today. He suffered from a lot of those afflictions. And during that time, there was people just didn't talk about as many those issues at that time. Now we know why. They were much more advanced, but at that time it was just not.
Would a second Kennedy administration, in your judgment, have revisited the effect on Cuba?
Yes, I think John F. Kennedy was so certainly adamant against trying to overturn and destroy communism. So yeah, I think it would have been. At some point, I think we would have gotten there. Yeah.